Welcome to this session. I need to explain for those who are just joining us now that this is part of a continuing programme that I teach here entitled Wine, Spirits and Society. And it's really about the social and cultural context of wine, the way producers view it, the way consumers view it, the way it operates in society, how it is managed by societies. And we use this class really as a chance to think about how wine functions and how it may be evolving within the communities that make it and drink it. Okay, so some of what I say will refer back to what I previously taught already to the MBA class that are here. Natural wine is a current and very significant trend in the world of wine, which is one reason why I want to address it in this context and the context of wine, spirits and society. What I'm going to do is talk briefly about what natural wine might be, although defining natural wine is very difficult. But I'm actually less interested in what natural wine is, as I am interested in why natural wine is. Why has natural wine become significant in the modern world of wine? As part of that, I'm going to talk a very small amount towards the end about authenticity and science, and I'm going to have some conclusions, obviously. But one of the things I want to stress, which I've been stressing all the way through this unit to the students who've been studying me over the last month or so, is that we need to come to thinking about wine with a very open mind. We need to question our assumptions about wine, what it is, how it operates in society, how and why people drink it. That includes me. I also need to come with that open mind. And we need to be willing to debate and discuss all aspects of wine, including in this case what natural wine is, but more particularly why people are becoming interested in it. Now, I want to start with an idea about the roots of natural wine, and you'll see this slide has got nothing to do with wine on it. Okay, but what I've done is actually take 3 books that appeared in the late 1960s, early 1970s, that I think have been very significant in changing and reshaping how we think about our world. Probably many of you have never heard of these books, but they have substantially influenced the way people are thinking about society and our global environment. Barbara Ward and René Dubois, Only One Earth, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which was about the damage that was being done to the environment. Ernst Schumacher, Small is Beautiful, trying to rethink the way we structure and organise our lives and our organisations. And at the time, they were seen to be very radical, but they've now become very much part of the mainstream of thinking about the world. And then I tie these books into a series of movements that have been evolving over 50 years, the counterculture that developed in the 1960s in the USA, punk, which may seem really odd to you, punk music, punk culture, as a reaction against very ordered, stereotyped view of music in particular and the world and the organisation of the world in general. Feminism, also the slow food movement, which has become very significant in the last 30 years, trying to challenge the ways we might think about food, but particularly the way the food industry organises itself and manages itself and deals with people. These are part of the cultural shifts that I think have underpinned the move towards natural wine. Natural wines become quite significant in discourse, the discourse of the modern world. I mean, here's just a selection from the New Yorker talking about natural wine, how natural wine became a symbol of virtuous consumption. Well, that's making an assumption to start with about natural wine and how good it is perceived to be. I want to start thinking about natural wine just by thinking about the word itself. Because what you do when you talk about natural wine, you pose a binary analysis. There is natural wine, the opposite is unnatural wine. By definition, people who are not drinking natural wine, however you define natural wine, must be drinking something that is not natural. And that's a really strong choice to make in your use of words. And I don't think many people, even who use the term natural wines, will think, oh, well, I'm drinking natural, the rest are all unnatural. You know, all the people me drinking a standard mass-produced Shiraz from Australia, they are drinking something that is unnatural. But most of the way the binary terms we use for describing wine don't work like that. Dry and sweet. You know, there's no virtue in wine being dry or virtue in wine being sweet, still or sparkling. Again, there's no good and there's no bad. They're just different categories. But the minute we talk about natural wine, we are trying to impose a value judgment on the understanding of the wine. I've suggested that maybe low intervention would be a better term, but as I'm not a paid-up member of the natural wine movement, I don't think anyone's going to listen to me. So that's not really so significant. One other thing I would say is that one other thing that has been natural for humanity since we have discovered things, as wine was discovered 8,000 years ago, or since we've invented things, is to try to make them better, however you define better. We've come to want to improve them. Not all improvements make the wine better. One of the big things that happened here in Burgundy in the 1950s, 60s, was the massive use of fertilizer with high levels of potassium in it, which reduced the effective acidity ultimately in wine and meant the wines were not as fresh or as light or as elegant as they could be. And crucially, they couldn't age as because they didn't have enough acidity in them to protect them. So improvements don't automatically make wine better, but some do, I would argue. The next thing, while we're just talking really about definitions, is natural wine faulty or is it different? There are a lot of critics of natural wine who say, oh, well, it's just an excuse for faulty wine. Now, look at, I've put up a couple of those perceived faults in wine there. One is mousiness in wine, which can happen in low sulfur dioxide environments and gives a really, really horrible taste, animal mouse cage-like taste to wine for about 2/3 or 3/4 of the population. Not everyone tastes it. Okay, my own view is that that is so disgusting. It is a fault. I've never heard anyone taste a mousy wine and say, oh, yum, that's really nice. Okay. I also suggest one of the, wines, white wines that taste like cider could be seen as a potential fault. Now, you've got to say they're different. They're not what we expect with a typical Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand or white Burgundy from here. They're different, but the fact that they may taste like cider, they've got quite high acetic acid, perhaps slight appley, slight oxidative characters, does that make them bad wines? They taste like an alcoholic drink. They may not be what I expect or you expect in a white wine. Does that mean they're bad? So I want to suggest that your perspective shapes how you view these wines. For some people, they will be faulty because they don't fit the organization we've made, the mental organization we've made for what wines should be like. For other people, though, they are just different and acceptable. I'll come back to that perhaps a little bit towards the end. What is a natural wine? I really hesitate to try and define it because one of the really interesting things about the natural wine movement is that there is no one single accepted definition. Everyone has got their own views about what it is. So it's not really my position to try and impose a definition on it. One that I got from the internet was a naturally fermented wine which has been made without additions and with nothing being taken out of the wine. But there will be all kinds of people who make what they call natural wine who will disagree with that. That's fine. Okay. The fact that there is no single definition, I think, is also important. I want to come back to that a bit later. So nothing added. Some people would say, yes, small amounts of things can be added. Perhaps that could include small amounts of sulfur dioxide to protect the wine. So there's different arguments there, but it does seem to me that low intervention at the very least is what you expect in a natural wine. Some people would say it's a winery focused equivalent to organic or biodynamic wine. Organic wine is defined by what you do in the vineyard. Biodynamic wine is mainly about what happens in the vineyard, but certain practices in the cellar. Natural wine is certainly concerned about the vineyard and about probably being organic, but it is also very much focused about what you do in the process of making the wine. I've also put up some specific styles of natural wine there, just to be clear that there are certain things that get included in this, but this is not an exclusive list of what makes low intervention natural wine. It has, as a concept, been given formal protected status in France. This is the that's the label you can have if you choose within France to make an accredited natural wine. But I've got to say that the way a lot of people talk about natural wine, the very idea of accreditation seems to me to be contradictory. The point about natural wine is they've never wanted to have a single definition. They've never all agreed about what it is. They've wanted it to be what you might call a large church, an open church, allowing lots of people in. There may be some things that are taken for granted, that are assumed. I mean, almost everyone who makes a natural wine would say we only use indigenous yeast. We will not add pre-prepared yeast in making our wine. But essentially, there are many different variants. So the idea of having an accreditation like that does seem to me to rather defeat the slightly anarchic object of the natural wine movement. I don't use anarchic as a negative term. I use it as an open term that allows many different ideas to flourish within the concept. Okay, where does it come from? I read one person writing about this who said it really is about a reaction in the post-Second World War environment to the increased industrialization, standardization, and mass production of wine. Okay, I've seen other people who say no, it has its roots further back, but very much it's a reaction against technology, intervention, and the use of the artificial. And one of the things you can say is that we are used now to a world of standardized wine. If you take a large volume brand, Jacob's Creek, Yellowtail, they are successful because they offer the consumer the same thing every time. And natural wine is a challenge to the idea that any brand or any product needs to be standardized. Even if different bottles from the same batch of wine taste different, does that matter? Now, some people will want to buy a drink and know exactly what they are tasting. Others might be happy to have the lottery of variability from bottle to bottle to bottle in a wine. A lot of people would say that the origins of natural wine are in Beaujolais. Excuse me. There's a very famous, influential enologist and negotiant, Jules Chauvet, who was active in Beaujolais both before the Second World War and then very influential after, who really people see as being the godfather of natural wine. Now, Chauvet is very interesting because he was extremely well scientifically trained. And he came to whatever he said about the production of wine with an absolutely rigorous scientific knowledge. He did not reject science. He did not reject technology. He said, but what he said was science and technology have to serve what is good in wine. What he did come to do is not so much argue to the return of some mythical golden age of wine that existed in the past, but what he wanted to do was to criticize the trends towards standardization and the blind use of scientific techniques and technology without thinking about what they were going to do to the wine. And in the end, he wanted to return wine to being something that was a product of an agricultural environment, not a scientific product. Now, interestingly, that led him to some quite interesting conclusions. One of these was it's much better to produce and age your wine in metals, in stainless steel tanks, than in wood, because wood by definition can become unhygienic. What you need is absolutely perfect hygiene if you are to make good wine. You must have very clean wine. He also accepted right to the end that as an absolute last result, you could you could add sulfur dioxide to your wine. You could even occasionally chaptalize it, that is, add sugar to put the alcohol level up if you really, really needed to do that. Okay, so he was not giving absolute 100% guaranteed rules for how to make the wine. He certainly believed that indigenous yeast, so non-artificial yeast, was fundamental to the wine. He saw the yeast as being part of the terroir of the wine. Now, that's an interesting point because he lived at a time when the idea was that the yeast existed in the vineyard and settled on the grapes and came into the winery with the grapes. We now know actually that the key, even when you use indigenous yeast, the key yeast populations that are important are those that exist in the winery, and they may come in part from non-local or non-indigenous populations. They may be brought in from elsewhere. So that's actually quite a difficult argument that the yeast is just part of the terroir these days. But he felt very strongly about this. Also happens in Beaujolais in the post-war period, when he is really significant developing his ideas, is the development of Beaujolais Nouveau. Mass-produced, very cheap Beaujolais that is sold in a couple of months of the harvest as a new wine, and was created effectively, although it represents in fact a very old style of wine, something that has existed for millennia, but it was developed as a new marketing technique. Let's get people to buy our Beaujolais. And it was a time when Beaujolais was not quite as well known as it wanted to be or had been in the future. It's a way of getting the wine out to a wider range of people. And for the short term or the medium term, it was very successful in marketing terms. Most of us would now have a fairly negative view of Beaujolais Nouveau. But what happens is you've got this vast expansion of this very industrial style young wine, slightly fruity, not very complex, not very profound, very standardized. And Chauvet has been talking against this, and he begins to influence other people in Beaujolais. And I've listed the four, what was called the Gap Four, very important people. And I put wines up from one of them there, from Lapierre. And you can actually see Lapierre today using very different approaches for different wines. They've got a very standard Beaujolais, which they will make using what we might broadly call natural methods, but also another wine that they make, which is, it claims no allegiance to Beaujolais, but is made absolutely within the constraints or the ideas of the natural wine movement. So it really starts perhaps in Beaujolais, although there are other places where people are beginning to think about natural wine, and it's certainly the ideas begin to spread very quickly. I'll come on to that shortly. We've got to say that because there is no single rule about what natural wine is, views about what it should be do split, and often there is not so much toleration of people who have different views to you. There's a lot of arguments. There are some people who say absolutely no sulfites in wine to protect the wine. Others will say yes, minimal sulfites are allowed. And there are big fights about this. Very recently, within the last month, there's been a big argument within the French natural wine movement around La Dive Bouteille, which is a very important natural wine fair, effectively in France, about whether or not wines should be designed to be very acceptable to a wide range of consumers, which includes using sulfites, or if you should be an absolute purist. So for me, this movement's very interesting. It's a belief system which is beginning to come together, but without an absolute dogma to it, at least yet. And to this extent, it reflects both a lot of religious movements that begin maybe with one or two people as visionaries who attract to them, but within a generation start to create arguments about what the true should be. We could see exactly the same politically on the extreme right and the extreme left, where you get, so on the extreme left, you get different Marxist groups that will argue about particular interpretations of Marxist texts and whether they are following this particular leader or this particular leader. And this particular interpretation or this particular interpretation, this belief system, which is so strongly held, is so important. It is a completely new way of understanding the world, but it fissures in terms of its understanding. And the natural wine movement really organizationally reflects a lot of the similar kind of belief systems in other areas. And crucially, do we remain absolutely pure to what we believe fundamentally, or do we accept that in order to be effective, we may make a few compromises? Compromises are acceptable. What can we go along with? Criticisms of natural wine. Okay, so from the outside. Natural wine claims it's against standardization. There are some people who say yes, but it standardizes styles of wine that may have lots of Brettanomyces, which is a yeast impact on the wine, which changes its character and reduces its fruitiness and underlines very much a very drying tannin. Or it may be that it standardizes acetic wines that are in the process of turning to vinegar. Now, those who believe in natural wine would say, this is what in this year my wine was moving towards. I'm not going to argue with it. This is the progression of the wine. But there are those from outside who would say, but your rejection of one kind of standardization, the standardization of technology, is actually creating another form of standardization. We can see this perhaps particularly with orange wine, with wines that are white wines that are fermented on their skins, which give it a darker, perhaps orange colour, and a level of tannin and certain consistent characteristics wherever in the world the orange wine is made. I'll come back to that perhaps towards the end, we'll see. The next criticism is that its adherents become too evangelical. That means not that they believe in what they are doing, which is perfectly reasonable, but they believe it is the only way that you can make wine, that any other wine is unacceptable, is not good, should not be available to people. There are other criticisms as well, and I've put up this is a long bit of text here. I'm sorry about that, but by now you should all have had time to read it, I hope. This is someone within the natural wine movement who points out that there are critics of it. It's you know, the flawed wines. I've talked a little bit about the flawed wines, but what this person says is proponents of natural wine say that these flaws actually are unique expressions of terroir. Well, you've already heard me talk terroir over the last, and my caution about terroir, but I've got to say, our floors terroir. The wine turns to the vinegar flies that have come in vast proportions this year and have had an impact on my wine? Is it about the acetic bacteria which grew rapidly this year? Is that a response to terroir? Now, so well, it's a response to the weather of that particular year, and I'm happy to look at that. Say that's not terroir, that's not reflecting how wine from that place should naturally be. So I'm cautious about some of the arguments that are put out, at least like this. I want to move on. So this is, if you like, what is natural wine and what are the criticisms of it? What are the arguments for it? How do people view it? I want to go back to some of the things I've already talked to you about over the last few weeks in some detail about the origins of wine. Wine starts just because there's a spontaneous fermentation of grapes. And as I've explained often, it's magic. It's got to be magic. For 8,000 years ago, there's no other explanation of how wine appears. It's a magical transformation. I want you to remember that magic, because I'm going to come back to that later. Magic becomes institutionalized, as we know, in a very religious interpretation as well. It becomes part of religions. There are gods or goddesses of wine. And indeed, even contemporary religions incorporate wine into their ritual. But what also happens is that there is, as wine is found, there is a rapid movement towards trying to improve, in inverted commas, the wine, particularly, some basic things like how to press wines, the development of presses, how you stop acetification happening. So we see additives, even perhaps 4,000 years ago, that might be put in wine to try and ward off the wine turning to vinegar, to delay it, or if it is going to turn to vinegar or oxide, help the flavour improve. And I've given some examples of quite old-fashioned forms of intervention. I love the first one there. Hesiod, a Greek writer 2,800 years ago, talks about picking grapes and leaving them to dry in the sun for 10 days and then leaving them to dry in the shade for another 4 days and then pressing them and turning them into wine. And this is almost identical to the way that PX wine is made in sherry today. But it's very interventionist. People are saying we are going to do things to the grapes in order to make the wine. It's not just pressing the juice out and then letting it ferment. So things get done quite quickly. I won't bother about the others. We probably need to move on here. I want to use some of this origins of wine. I just want you to bear this in mind, because I'm going to come back to some of these themes. And now what I am perhaps most interested in is, why has natural wine become so important in the last 15 to 20 years? And I'm going to look at what producers think, and or how it benefits producers, how it benefits intermediaries, and how consumers might feel about natural wine and why they may want to drink wine. And my first suggestion may annoy the true believers in natural wine. If you look at where natural wine has been most evident, it is in regions which are not the most successful. Now, I'm going to start by talking about France here. If you look at this, in the Côte d'Or, we have 2 registered natural wine producers, that is, who've taken on the charter of Vin Nature. Okay. There are 13 in Bordeaux. There's none in Champagne. Those at the moment are the 3 regions of France that, if you look at export markets, are really, really successful and selling their wines for a great deal of money. There are the 2 in the Côte d'Or here, 7 up in Alsace. There are getting on for 20 the whole of the region, including 16 in the 2 départements of Maine and Indre. Okay? There are a lot in the south of France. Look. Okay. Now, but all around here, you go to Ardèche, you go to the Aude, you go to the Pyrénées, Orientales, Vaucluse. There's lots. As an aside, a cynic would say, if you are in a hot, dry area, it is easier to make natural wine safely, as it is easier to make organic wine safely, because often in the vineyard, at least, it is humidity and cold which is going to harm your harvest. But what crucially this says to me is, if your wine region is successful, if you're selling your wine for a lot of money, you don't think about being natural. If you are feeling marginalized, you're on the outside, you are much likely to think, look, being natural wine may give me an advantage in the market. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that people who go into natural wine are cynically exploiting this for economic purposes. I think they genuinely believe in it, but I think this is an advantage they get out of being involved in natural wine. If you look at other countries, I mean, Italy, there's quite a lot of natural wine, but some of the key places where natural wine's been significant are not so much Chianti, Barolo. There are producers in Barolo who are very, very careful about their wine, might even tend towards natural wine, but it's very much been significant in less well-known regions. And look at the other countries where it is. Natural wine these days, it's everywhere, but very significant in Slovenia, in Austria, smaller wine producing countries, Greece as well, rather than the larger scale ones. And certainly historically, the US particularly has avoided having too many natural wine producers. And that is beginning to change. The same perhaps with somewhere like Australia. So what do producers get out of it? I'm going to say, to start with, I think there is a clear economic advantage in certain places. As I say, I'm not trying to be cynical, but I think that exists. I think there is a genuine reaction against the influence of large companies. I think there are small producers who look at large companies and say, we are debasing what we are trying to do. They're really undermining the value of wine because they are so big they cannot really pay attention to what they're making with their wine. I think this is a reaction partly economic because the large companies appear to be successful. They aren't always, but also very cultural for a lot of people who believe that small is better. Now, this reaction is something you see a lot in Champagne with the vignerons as opposed to the maison in Champagne. It doesn't get interpreted in terms of natural wine, but it still exists, this cultural reaction. I think there is also a very strong commitment to being in harmony with nature, as someone put it. And I got this actually from talking with a former student a couple of weeks ago. We even sing to our wines, says one natural wine producer. That's one form of harmony, of course, you hope, but it is about trying to take the wines away from just how you're going to manipulate them to finding other ways of looking after them or underlining their value. So I think that there is a genuine, and certainly with Jules Chauvet, this was really important. This return to nature, that we are destroying the natural context of wine with our science and our technology. We can use the science and technology, but only to underscore the natural. Intermediaries, writers, marketers, bloggers, lots of people who are involved between producers and consumers also gain benefits, I think, from natural wine. There is a plethora now of these intermediaries, and I've said before in class, if you go back 20 years, the people who were writing and talking about wine were, the globally important people were less than 100. Now, there are tens of thousands who are online trying to influence other people to talk about wine. When there is such a vast increase in people who are talking about wine, you've got to start having things to make your value as an intermediary stand out. One of the ways you can do it is to be involved with natural wine and the natural wine movement. Again, I'm not saying this is cynical. No one sits there and says, I don't about natural wine, but hey, I'm going to use it to make myself more important as an intermediary. I think that people who support natural wine genuinely believe in it. But I think there is this very distinct benefit to them. They become a key part of a movement. They become distinctive, and they have people who are listening to them. I also think that a lot of intermediaries, the key thing about intermediaries is they get bored easily. Okay, Australian wine, 25 years ago, it was really popular in the UK, and a lot of critics were saying it's a breath of fresh air compared with the rather faulty wines we've been getting often from Europe, or even not just the faulty wines, but the wines from Europe they're just a bit uninteresting. Whereas suddenly Australian wines, they are full of fruit, they're full of flavour, they reflect Australia in a glass. This is wonderful. 10 years later, those same critics are saying Australian wine, it's all very boring. Been there, done that. We know what they're going to taste like. Okay, what's the next thing that we can get stuck into? So I think that critics often, they want to move on to something new, and in some cases I think there's a lot that where we might, even those of us who don't necessarily see ourselves within the natural wine fold, we might agree with them. There's, you know, there is a reaction against clean, powerful, expensive, often highly extracted, over-oaked wines, which have been traditionally promoted by certain critics. Okay, and there are others who say this is too limited. This is not what wine should be. Let's look at other ways of understanding wine. Let's look at natural wine. I think there's also this sense, and I might come back to this, that the danger with that old way of looking at wine, about big, bold, very impressive, is all you're looking at is a perceived quality of the wine. And I think there's a reaction. I'll come on to this very much in the next slide when we look at consumers. But I think intermediaries have also been very keen to say, in the end, wine is not about how impressive aesthetic value. It is about conviviality. It's about enjoying wine together. And the traditional wines that critics had been praising don't allow that, often because they're too expensive for most of us anyway. Okay, why natural wine? Consumers. I think the first reason why consumers would like to talk about natural wine, it goes back to these environmental problems, use of pesticides and things like that. Natural wine is healthier. It's better for our body. Is it healthier? I don't really want to get involved in that debate. That is a scientific debate, whether or not the natural methods are healthier for people. But there is a perception that they are healthier. Okay. Transparency. You know what you're getting. The people who make natural wine want to be very clear about what they're doing with the wine. That's fair. As a consumer, you want to know what's in the wine. You want to know how it's made, what they've done, what they haven't done. There have been very lax laws on additives in wine worldwide. That is beginning to change, but the consumers who want to drink natural wine will say, they will tell me if they're using small amounts of sulfites. They'll tell me if they've manipulated the wine in some way. I will learn about that. It's transformative. Go back to that magic I was talking about earlier, the magic of wine. Magic changes you. Magic wine in the first place. But what that being part of that magic with natural wine is changing the wine for the better, the world for the better. You're being much more sensitive. You're therefore improving the world, and at the same time it's transforming you as well, because it is better for you as I just said. I think the next reason why natural wine has become so important with consumers is because of young people. Okay, and I've given a whole range of reasons there why young people particularly might be very interested in natural wine. Younger people are much more environmentally aware than people of my generation. That is a good thing. Initially, particularly, natural wine was perceived to be a lot cheaper than conventional wine. Some of it, the way it was made, often allowed it to be cheaper because less had been done to it. And I think, again, there's this sense of resistance. Parents and what they might be drinking against an establishment which tells you what you need to drink. And I think a resistance against the complexity and this complexity of the value, the aesthetic value of wine, that people wanted to say, forget that. Don't tell me how good it is. Don't tell me, how tense it is. Tell me how smooth the tannins are. Give me a wine I can sit down with friends and we can just enjoy. And you get this concept of the French term glou-glou wine, which you would translate into English as gluggable or quaffable. It's just something you can drink and you enjoy it, and that's fine. How delicious is it? Let's move on from there. I think there's two other things I want to say. You're all being very quiet. I mean, if anyone does have questions at this stage, you can. Yes, there's a question coming out from Elizabeth at the back there. Yeah, you do need a microphone, Elizabeth. I'm quite happy that you're quiet and you're allowing me to talk. That's all good, but it's very unusual for you. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Okay. So of the 70-something additives that are allowed in most conventional wines, is there any scientific evidence that those are harmful for humans, or is this just something that proponents of natural wine use as marketing?
Some additives may have cause problems for humans, including sulfur dioxide, although the number of people who are going to be harmed by sulfur dioxide is very proportionately very, very small. So and these days in every country where wine is made, there are more and more checks about the safety of the additives. On the other hand, there is a general feeling that putting things into your body and when you don't know what they are and when they are artificial is not a good thing. Look at the reaction against vaccines under COVID-19. I mean, as it happens, I believe that putting those things in your body in the end was very good for you and saved a lot of lives. But that's there's an argument over that. And I don't want to get into COVID-19. But I think there's also this sort of additive effect. That is, the more you put into your body that might individually not be apparently harmful, the more problems you might be causing for your body. Does that help?
So why is it different with wine than with like processed foods?
I think that's too big a question, Elizabeth, especially today when there's been this mega study which has shown that processed foods, ultra processed foods, are connected with 32 different potential harmful effects and diseases. My own view as a layperson is that ultra processed foods are demonstrably much worse than any single additive that's put into wine. Okay, but people will make their own choices about what they do and don't want to put into their body. I think I want to leave it there on that, if you don't mind. But thanks for the question. It's a good question. Okay. Okay. Why natural wine? There's a couple of other things I want to say. One, and this applies not just to consumers, but to everyone in that chain I've been talking about, is the notion of authenticity. Authenticity as a generalized concept in society has only really arisen in the last 20 or 30 years. Okay, I put a couple of quotations from marketing researchers up there. Stephen Brown saying 20 years ago, the search for authenticity is one of the cornerstones of contemporary marketing. So there is this marketing take. If we're going to sell our product, we need to make it authentic. That in itself is a dangerous concept, because the minute you market something as authentic, how authentic can it be? Because of this next thing. Another marketing academic, marketing is a phoniness generating machine. It is designed to create something that is untrue or deceptive or non-genuine. It makes promises a company cannot keep. And there's a lot of studies. I mean, even 20 years ago in France, it was shown that 55% of the population wanted to buy authentic products. That has been growing in the last 20 years. Authenticity is very significant for a lot of consumers. The problem you have is, what is authenticity? And there's been a lot of academic research which sort of categorizes ideas around authenticity, which I don't have the time to go into now. But beyond that, if we look at wine, what is authentic wine? There's many different ways of looking at authentic wine. Okay, traditional wines, wine with terroir, historical style, an environmentally acceptable wine, artisanal, genuine, sincere, a wine which makes me feel that I'm doing the right thing. Okay, all of these things. Now, these things can apply in different places. A historical style has got no impact on the New Zealand wine industry, but an environmentally acceptable wine is very important for the New Zealand wine industry. Okay, artisanal wine is about small scale, careful production. That cuts across the whole of the world. But there are other wines that claim to be traditional, like many large volume champagnes, which are being presented as something that's been in this way for 300 years, that claim authenticity because of the tradition. So authenticity is a very contested idea. But I think that natural wine, for many reasons, plays into this idea of being authentic. It is something that's genuine. The people who make it are genuine. They're trying to be transparent. They're trying to give us something that's good for us, something that's healthy. They're not trying to trick it up with too much sugar or something artificial in it. Yeah, Amy's got a question over there.
Do you think in the future there will be a more precise definition around natural wine, or there's kind of advocacy and preference to keep it more loose and
Can I try and answer that question later and come back right at the end if you're not satisfied, Amy? Because I just want to talk a little bit about this understanding of the natural wine movement and how it operates. Okay, so authenticity. The next thing I want to talk about is the role of science. As religion dies, science has replaced it. Science becomes, for many people, a new religion. Science becomes, if you like, the religion that underpins wine. Beforehand, it was a god or a goddess. Now it becomes science. If anyone's interested, there's an extremely good book looking at the evolution of the use of science within the French wine industry from about 1840 into the 20th century, which shows how science becomes more and more significant as the way of understanding French wine, the way of making French wine. But science is ambivalent. Okay, we look at science. Science is capable of saving so many lives and also of creating the weapons that can destroy so many lives. Is science a good thing? And I think that natural wine plays into a certain reaction against too much science, against expertise, against we know best, against one solution for everything. It offers multiple solutions, multiple ways of seeing the world. Okay, we're coming towards the end now. Actually, I'm just going to take a slight detour. This is something that I found when I was studying. This is not a complaint about people who promote natural wine. This is just, it goes back to the other things I've said in class before about knowing what to believe online. Okay, I came across this first piece in quotation marks. So it was claimed to be a direct quotation from a very well-known theologist of wine and the early drinks production throughout the Middle East and Europe, Patrick McGovern. And it's what it claims he said was the oldest evidence of wine, which dates back 8,000 years, comes from Georgia. It was made in clay vessel called kfefri. It's likely that these wines were natural by today's standards. So the person who put this online said, this is what Patrick McGovern said. And I looked at that and I thought, this doesn't sound like Patrick McGovern to me. And I don't see that there's the evidence here. So I went back to the article it was said to come from. What he says is there are no examples of large jars in Georgia for the 5,000 years from the Neolithic period, so from 8,000 years ago, to the Iron Age times, about 3,000, 2,500 years ago. Okay? And nothing about natural wine. That's just put that in briefly as a warning to be really careful about what you believe. And I'm not using this to say natural wine, proponents of natural wine actually deliberately lie to people en masse. I think scientists are capable of lying to people en masse when they want to. Okay, so let's summarize some conclusions. What about natural wine? Is natural wine a way of making wine, or is it a phenomenon about identity and descent? And Amy, I think this goes back to your question. I think at the minute it is not about a single way of making wine. It's been deliberately left open to allow for debate, because I think people who are involved in it don't want to say we are part of this particular set of beliefs, this set of dogma. I mean, even though if you look at the 20 méthodes nature that you have in France, there's a whole long list of what people will believe. Okay, much of which we can look at, and even not necessarily into natural wine, will say this is good, this is good, this is good. Okay, but there is that long list. It hasn't happened elsewhere. And even with France, there are people who will work outside of this just because there's something that they don't agree with there. So it is, I think, a movement. And in this, it differs from biodynamics. Biodynamics has prescription about what you will do. Natural wine doesn't. It is magical rather than religious. It wants to transform. It wants to change. It's not about a dogma, perhaps. It's about the environment against what people can do. It's very much pro-environment. It's about being artisanal in the face of scientific and technological and indeed economic size hegemony. It's about saying small scale is really good, is really useful. Now, there are many artisanal producers outside the natural wine movement, but this is, I think this is one of the key defining things. It's about making wine easier. Keep it simple, stupid. Just enjoy the wine for what it is. Don't worry about where it comes from. You don't need to know about the grapes necessarily. Don't worry about how it's made. The winemakers tell you that she used the minimum intervention possible. That's all you need to know. It is an invented tradition. Actually, the way natural wines are made these days, people talk about going back to before the Second World War, but as I've shown, there are technological ways of making wine that go back thousands of years. It may be going back to the earliest times of making wine in some people's heads, except those very earliest times saw the first wine producers wanting to evolve the technology rapidly. And I think it is also at times a means of distinction, of providing cultural and economic capital. Those are my conclusions. Okay, I've tried to stand apart. I've tried to avoid my own views, whatever they may be about natural wine, and just try and, as I say, I'm really interested in why this has happened now. And I think there's a whole series of cultural issues, along with some economic issues, feeding into it. So I hope that's given you some ideas.